Today, I want to introduce you to a family who have had a significant part to play in the shaping of Cannock Chase, having been owners and sometimes even builders of some of its great halls, in large part responsible for the development of the canal network and leaving behind many a fond tale and reminiscence, to say nothing about their impact upon the political scene of the country at large. Today, I'm talking about the Littletons, who more recently have been known to many as the Hathertons. The first part of this video is largely historical in nature and provides context for the discussion at the end. If you're here for the ghost story, then you might want to jump to the chapter of the video called Spectral Sir Hugh Reclaims His Goblet Skull. To set the scene, Hatherton is an area to the southwest of Cannock Chase. From Michael Raven's Guide to Staffordshire, we can learn that in 994, Lady Wulfruna gave Hatherton to the monastery of Wolverhampton. In the Domesday Book, it is called Haggerthornden, the hill where hawthorns grow. The Littletons are a very old English family who originated in Worcestershire, an early notable ancestor being Sir Thomas de Littleton, an important judge in the mid-15th century. One of the children of Sir Thomas de Littleton was called Richard, and it's here that the root of their connection to Hatherton takes hold. For Richard married Alice Winsbury, heiress of Pillerton Hall near Penkridge. Their likeness is recorded in a monument slab at the ancient church of St. Michael and All Angels. From then on, Pillerton Hall would be an important seat for the Littletons. What remains of Pillerton Hall today is the 15th century gatehouse, alongside an east-facing chapel which is dedicated to St. Modwen, and a west wing which replaced the original, built out of modern bricks in the last century. The gatehouse is of Tudor design, and originally the house and its wings encompassed the entire courtyard. A few ruins still give a hint as to the shape of the full house, which was partially demolished around 1745. The moat, which can still be seen very prominently from the front of the house, is far older. Indeed, consulting the Victoria County history, we can see mention of a Pilathala between 1114 and 1135. While I am not a linguist, a quick consultation of Wiktionary certainly suggests the suffix hala likely meaning hall, suggesting the Tudor design replaced an older Norman one. Many of the descendants of Richard Littleton were important figures for Staffordshire, usually serving as MPs or sheriffs, and from his own son onward, the name Edward became the traditional given name to the family's heir. 4 generations later, in 1627, would be created the Littleton baronetcy of Pillerton Hall, which sustained for a further 4 generations. In 1742, the 3rd Baron Littleton passed away without any children of his own, leaving behind only a widow, Dame Mary. Thus, fate turned to what was to be the final of the Littleton barons, a nephew of the previous Lord Littleton, who was raised on the other side of Cannock Chase at Pipe Ridware, also named Edward Littleton, as was now the enduring tradition. Sir Edward Littleton was a remarkable character. There were 7 long years between the death of his uncle and his arrival to claim his inheritance, in which time he would come to be tested greatly. In 1745, the Jacobite rebellions were stirring, but the British army were abroad. So, Lord Lieutenant of Staffordshire, Lord Gower, called on gentlemen of family and fortune in the county to become captains in a new Staffordshire regiment and meet this new threat. Despite being only 18 at the time, Sir Edward rose to the challenge and agreed to raise a company of 67 men. Initially, danger drew uncomfortably close, as the Jacobite force reached Manchester and prepared to move south. But a few weeks later the situation had changed radically. They had taken the road through Derbyshire and had been rebuked, retreating to the north. He could eventually return to his studies in March 1746, a little over a month before the battle at Culloden. Dame Mary was still in residence at Pillerton Hall, and would live there until 1761, so Sir Edward instead chose to take up residence at a hunting lodge 2 miles away at Teddesley Coppice. As the story tells it, the very instant the young lord arrived at Teddesley, all the rooks that resided at Pillerton Hall abandoned the rookery and joined him. As there was no rookery at the hunting lodge, they settled in the trees nearby. To the local people who witnessed this, it was taken as a good omen that this man was without doubt the true heir of the family. Towards the end of his life, he would sign a piece of paper that retold this event with the line, "I certify that the above is true." In 1752, Sir Littleton married Frances Horton of Catton Hall, Derbyshire. 2 years later, he drew up plans for a new seat for his family at Teddesley, as he was never particularly fond of Pillerton to begin with. Ironically, as local folklore holds, it would be Pillerton Hall that aided him in his work, as much of the hall was being demolished due to its ruinous state in the 1740s. A discovery was made behind the oak panelling of a chimney breast in an upstairs room. 25 leather purses, containing a value of £15,749, in a mixture of old coins. Today, this would be worth a little over £3.5 million. No explanation for the stash is apparent, though alongside the coins was a beautiful silver chalice and paten, which are believed to be from the 16th century and would have originally been kept in the chapel, as well as a beautifully carved wooden statue, estimated to be from the 13th century. Who the statue depicts is a matter of debate. Many experts believe it to be Herod, though if we go back to the name of the hall as it was at the time, Pilathala, there is a strong linguistic possibility the other half of the word we're looking for is Pilate. The popular understanding is that this vast and sudden abundance of wealth greatly eased the burden of building the new hall. Teddesley was large but austere, a 3-storied square brick structure with stone dressings. There were 7 windows on the upper stories on all 4 faces. Its frontage to the garden had a large projecting bay. Though many who see the photographs of the hall today find it to be beautiful, this was not quite the opinion of the time. In December 1789, Gentleman's Magazine commented that the hall was in the style of modern taste, quite plain on the outside and rather deficient in the usual graces of architecture. But the house and offices are sufficiently expensive, and the apartments commodious and elegantly fitted up. The hall stood until 1954, when after being sold to new owners, it was demolished. In around 1817, Sir Edward Littleton made one of the many shrewd investments of his lifetime, when he bought 20 shares in the Staffordshire and Worcester Canal Company, which he became the chairman of. Thanks to his vision, by 1841, the Hatherton branch of the canal had been constructed, servicing the Cannock coalfields and having a dramatic impact upon the area.
The Worley and Essington Canal was built to carry the principal product of the districts of which it served. This principal product was coal. The canal was extended to make a route through to the Coventry Canal at Huddlesford Junction near Lichfield. This opened in 1797. The Worley and Essington Canal was amalgamated with the Birmingham Canal navigations in 1840, and the canal, with its 30 locks and numerous basins, was a vital link in the movement of coal and would remain so for many years. The rich Cannock coalfields were to yield this black gold for more than a century, and loading of boats carried on both night and day with the coal which fueled the Industrial Revolution. Lord Hatherton, chairman of the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal Company, also grasped the opportunity of tapping the coal trade, and by 1841 the Hatherton branch had been built to Churchbridge near Cannock. By the early 1860s, a link was forged with the Birmingham Canal Navigations Company, which resulted in the construction of Churchbridge locks. Thus, an entry point was made into the BCN system with ready access to the extensive coalfield trade. All was well until the coal ran out. With the routes not required and the flames of former prosperity extinguished, the canals were abandoned.
The canal languished with the end of the mining in the area, but efforts are being undertaken to restore at least part of the route by the Lichfield and Hatherton Canal Restoration Trust. Sadly, due to the extent of the development in the area, it's unlikely we will ever see the full glory of the 13 locks at Churchbridge ever return. Unfortunately, Francis Littleton died childless in 1781, which caused the Littleton baronetcy to lapse, and the inheritance passed to Edward Walhouse, the grandson of Francis Littleton's sister, who had married Walsall businessman Morton Walhouse. The condition of this inheritance was that Edward changed his last name to Littleton, which he did. This left Edward to inherit both the assets of the Littleton family, which were considerable, but also the wealth of the Walhouses, which included Hatherton Hall, in addition to Pillerton and Teddesley. When he received his own baronetcy in 1835, it was from this hall the name was taken, as he became Baron Hatherton. This peerage is still active today in his descendants. Hatherton Hall near Cannock is a Grade II listed building that was rebuilt in 1817 by Edward's father at the cost of £14,000 at the time. He remarked in his journal on April 12, 1858 that, "I never enter that house without regretting that it was built. The venerable and most curious old structure it replaced would have been far more valuable. Indeed, there are some indications that this hall too may have originally been Norman. Some stones on the grounds and comprising the foundations certainly do appear to be the correct age, and this is the opinion of the current owner and resident." Baron Hatherton was famous in his own right for many actions. He turned much of his land from useless bogs into fertile farming land, using new and innovative agricultural techniques. He was a politician and chief secretary for Ireland for a time. Many political cartoons relating to him still exist in the British Library. He was instrumental in the Truck Act of 1831, a major move against a kind of economic slavery endangering the working class. His wife had a similar renown, but for different reasons. She was the niece of the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo. Her name was Mary Hyacinth Wellesley. A memory of her is recorded in The Friendship of Cannock Chase by Pitman, and reads thus: Mary Hyacinth Wellesley, niece of the Duke of Wellington, who married 21-year-old Edward John Littleton of Teddesley Hall, was one of the society beauties of the day, and it was not surprising that the rich young Member of Parliament for Staffordshire should at once request Sir Thomas Lawrence to paint her portrait. That picture may still be seen adorning the walls of the Littletons at Hatherton Hall. In the last 200 years of Cannock Chase history, no names stand higher for the influence wielded for good on the life of the district than those of the distinguished pair who became the first Baron and Lady Hatherton. In the autumn of 1812, everybody in Brighton was talking about the presence in their midst of the 5 reigning beauties of London. One of them was Hyacinth Littleton. Littleton saw all 5 35 years later, and said, "The brightest is certainly greatly faded, but there is more freshness left about my flower than the rest, and much grace about all of them." Emperor Alexander I of Russia had no hesitation in declaring Hyacinth Littleton to be the handsomest woman in England. Attending a ball in Naples many years later, Littleton came to the conclusion that there was only one handsome lady in the room, with the exception of Lady Hatherton. Hyacinth was always the handsomest woman in the world to Littleton, but he had an eye for the beauty of other women also. She, on her part, was flattered to feel that she held the field in all the comparisons her husband made. In truth, there is far too much of interest in the past of this family to cover in such a short video. But one story stands out above the rest if you are interested in folklore, found also in the same book, The Friendship of Cannock Chase. It's the story of Sir Hugh de Hatherton. As this work is now long since public domain, on this occasion I will relate it verbatim. One Christmas Eve, in the middle of the 19th century, a merry party of men was gathered in the dining room at Hatherton Hall. They had all been at Christchurch together, and Hatherton, the host, full of hospitable geniality, ordered the butler to bring in a bottle of the best port. It was known as the family port, and had been in the cellar for 20 years. Later, as the men were waiting for the ladies to return from a ball, they went into the study, which had a goodly stock of guns, hunting whips, stag's antlers, fox brushes, pistols, and other features of a sporting character. "Ah, Hatherton," said one of the guests, who had been looking about the room. "Why, what have you here? On what rare occasions do you use this goblet of such questionable shape?" As he spoke, he held up to view a human skull, which had been so fashioned and prepared as to answer the purpose of a drinking cup. Hatherton explained the head belonged once upon a time to Sir Hugh de Hatherton, an illustrious ancestor of his. The skeleton of Sir Hugh had been unearthed some years before on the spot where a private chapel used to stand. The head had become separated from the body, and so he had lined it with silver and set it up as a goblet. Having spoken thus, Hatherton filled the goblet with burgundy, and as they drank from it they all vowed wine never tasted so well as it did out of that ghostly bowl. "And now," said Hatherton, "that we've pledged ourselves, each other, and heaven knows what other person besides, let us drink the health of Sir Hugh, who formerly owned this head. Wherever you may be, we drink to you, and would that we could have you with us tonight, even though we had to surrender you your head once more," said Hatherton, as he raised the goblet. As the last stroke of 12 was fading away, the drained goblet was placed on the table. "Hush! What is that?" exclaimed one of the guests. The sounds of footfalls were heard advancing along the corridor. The skull on the table began to move. It rolled slowly round till, at last, it reached the edge, and then it dropped off, and appeared to fall beneath the table. The ghostly form swung into the room as the door opened of its own accord. The headless form approached the table and bent down. "Sir Hugh de Hatherton!" all the startled men cried, but the skeleton knight gave no answer. He made a true knightly bow, closed the door, and strode down the corridor, the clank of his spectral armour gradually dying down as the figure receded. The arrival of the ladies from the ball drew the terrified host and his guests from the library before they had the opportunity to pursue their investigations into the extraordinary happenings. But they lost no time in the following morning in making a search for the skull goblet. It was nowhere to be found. No one had seen it since the incidents of the previous night. Hatherton's study opened onto a lawn, and when the searchers stepped through an open window to hear the clear music of the Christmas bells at Cannock Church, they picked up from the crisp, frosty grass what appeared to be a ball of silver. It was found to be a thin silver plate, rolled flat into the shape of a ball. It was the silver which had lined the skull goblet. In vain was the search for the skull. The only conclusion Hatherton and his friends could make was that Sir Hugh de Hatherton, while indulging in the pardonable wish to regain his property, which was, without question, legally his own, had a knightly horror of taking by the most rigid interpretation of the law he could not with propriety claim. Such is the story of the Hatherton skull goblet, as gleaned from an old book. This is one of my favourite ghost stories from the Cannock Chase area. However, some aspects of the story are rather confusing, and in fact this is altogether one of the least convincing tales recorded by Pitman. Though through my usual investigations I have found some interesting supporting evidence. The story itself does not provide much in the way of a source, simply stating that it was gleaned from an old book. I first thought that this possibly might be the journal kept by the first Baron Hatherton, recently edited and reprinted by Mr. Ken Lees. However, on no such Christmas Eve was such an event recorded, though some were noted to have been spent at Hatherton Hall. I spoke with multiple experts on the subject, including the Landor Society, as well as historian Robert Maddox of Penkridge, neither of whom were aware of any such book, despite Mr. Maddox having spent a great deal of time examining records relating to the Littleton family. In fact, we cannot even be sure which Baron Hatherton the story is referring to. The Christmas Eve in question is mentioned as in the middle of the 19th century, which would suggest it to be around 1850, and as such, the first Baron Hatherton, Edward John Littleton, is a strong contender. However, there is the question of the private chapel, which was said was used to stand somewhere on land owned by Baron Hatherton. He owned vast amounts of land at the time, so the exact site is hard to discern. I can find no record of a freestanding chapel at Hatherton Hall itself. Upon visiting, I was informed by the owner there is a private chapel. However, as it's located on the top floor of the house, it can be discounted. There is the ancient chapel at Pillerton Hall, though, the one dedicated to St. Modwen, which underwent extensive renovations in the Victorian era, concluding in 1888 as is commemorated on the exterior. This falls slightly outside the definition of the middle of the 19th century, but does seem from my research to be the most likely candidate. Mr. Anthony Littleton currently resides here, and he was kind enough to facilitate my access for this video. He did say, however, that as far as he was aware, the original floor had never been disturbed in the renovations, which would make it difficult to discover such a body. In fact, despite the story supposedly being one relating to his family, he confirmed it was not one that had been passed down orally through the generations. Regardless, if we assume the chapel mentioned is indeed the one at Pillerton, then it becomes likely the Lord Hatherton mentioned is Edward George Littleton, 3rd Baron Hatherton. Who then is our mysterious spectral knight, Sir Hugh de Hatherton? Well, a quick consultation of the family tree reveals that none of the Baron Hathertons or their immediate family fit, nor does any immediate Littleton ancestor I have been able to trace. The clue perhaps is that he is named D. Hatherton, D being a particle originating in French used before one's family name to mean of an area. Again then we have a Norman connection, and this gives us a hint to search closer to the times of William the Conqueror. Returning to the Victoria County history, we can see two exciting possibilities. For a time, a man named Hugh le Blund was indeed an owner of a manor in Penkridge as early as 1271. This possession passed through several of his descendants before the final Hugh le Blund dies in 1361. Notably, he was credited with the honorific of Sir. Alternatively, Hugh de Loge, Lord of Great Worley in Cannock, held Otherton in 1237, and by 1255 his tenant was Adam de Otherton, a direct ancestor of the Winsburys, and therefore the Littletons of Pillerton Hall and the Lords Hatherton. Could this be the Sir Hugh mistakenly referred to as an ancestor of Lord Hatherton in the tale? Confirmation of such speculation is not within the scope of my simple video, and must unfortunately be left to serious historians to comment upon. However, I was surprised to learn just how much potential basis there was for this story, which on the surface seems so poorly referenced. I hope you enjoyed this historical overview and this little known tale of Sir Hugh. I would like to extend my sincerest thanks to Mr. Anthony Littleton for allowing me to film his beautiful and historic home, to Mr. Ken Lees for allowing me access to what remains of Teddesley, and for his efforts to publish the diaries of the first Lord Hatherton. I must also thank Mr. George Homer of Hatherton Hall for being so accommodating in my research. Finally, this video would not have been the same without the many years of research done by Mr. Robert Maddox of Penkridge. The majority of the historical overview is taken from his book, The Littletons of Teddesley Hall. I typically don't review books I reference, but this book is so well put together I have to recommend it for anyone with even a passing interest in local history. The stories of this family, the bulk and best of which have been omitted for brevity here, are told superbly, and quality citations are provided throughout. It really is everything I could have wanted out of such a publication. Currently, I can only find the book for sale second-hand or in the county libraries, but if that changes, I will link directly to where it can be purchased in the description below. Do you know any more about the story? Could you recommend what my next subject should be? Let me know in the comment section down below, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you learned something new today.